Donald Trump has just set off a global economic firestorm, and the ripple effects are being felt far beyond Washington. In a move that's already sending shockwaves through international markets, Trump has slapped a massive 25% tariff on European car imports. His administration insists it's a long overdue correction to what they call an unfair trade system. But across the Atlantic, the reaction has been anything but quiet. The European Union wasted no time hitting back, hard. In what's shaping up to be an all-out economic showdown, the EU has rolled out its own set of countermeasures, striking at the heart of key American industries. And this isn't just about European cars getting pricier in the US. The EU's response is laser-focused, designed to inflict economic pain exactly where it hurts most. Republican-led states that form the backbone of Trump's political support. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made it clear, Brussels isn't backing down. Speaking from the EU headquarters, she vowed that any aggressive trade moves from the US would be met with an equally forceful response. And she wasn't bluffing. The EU's retaliatory tariffs, worth a staggering 26 billion euros, are aimed squarely at industries that fuel America's economy: agriculture, technology, and consumer goods. But this isn't a broad economic crackdown. It's a calculated, politically charged strike. Take Louisiana, for example. Soybeans from the state, home to House Speaker Mike Johnson, are now facing steep new duties. Meanwhile, beef and poultry from Kansas and Nebraska, along with farm exports from Alabama, Georgia, and Virginia, are all caught in the crosshairs. If this feels familiar, that's because it is. During Trump's first term, his steel and aluminum tariffs triggered a similar response. Europe fired back with targeted taxes on iconic American products: Harley-Davidson's, bourbon, and Levi's jeans. But this time, the stakes are even higher. Trump's endgame? Bring manufacturing jobs back to US soil by making foreign imports too expensive. But critics warn this gamble could backfire, badly. Even within the US, alarms are ringing. The American Chamber of Commerce to the EU is calling for an immediate de-escalation, warning that this trade war isn't just a battle over cars. If tensions keep rising, it could morph into a full-blown economic crisis, jeopardizing jobs, investments, and even diplomatic ties between two of the world's biggest allies. The European Union isn't just pushing back, they're gearing up for a long and drawn-out trade fight. In a dramatic turn, the EU is dusting off trade restrictions from Trump's first presidency, rules that were put on hold during Biden's term, but are now making a comeback. Starting April 1st, these measures will kick in, followed by an even bigger wave of tariffs set to hit just weeks later on April 13th. We're talking about nearly $20 billion worth of American exports facing steep new taxes. So, who's going to feel it first? Well, for starters, the US auto industry is already on high alert. Many American car manufacturers rely on specialized European parts. Think cutting-edge transmissions from Germany, advanced electrical systems from France, and finely tuned mechanical components from Italy. Trump's plan is to push automakers to build everything in the US, but here's the problem. These parts aren't easy to replace. Production costs are about to shoot up, supply chains could be thrown into chaos, and for everyday Americans, that means one thing: higher car prices. Meanwhile, European leaders are looking at the bigger picture. With tensions rising, they're exploring deeper trade relationships with Asia, especially China. If Europe shifts its economic focus eastward, it could completely reshape global trade, leaving the US struggling to keep up. And it's not just cars that could be affected. The energy sector is another major battleground. Right now, the US supplies Europe with massive amounts of liquefied natural gas, LNG. But if this trade war drags on, European buyers may start looking elsewhere. That could mean billions in lost revenue for American energy companies. For automakers like Ford, General Motors, and Tesla, the timing couldn't be worse. All three brands rely on European suppliers to keep their production lines moving. Ford's trucks, GM's SUVs, and Tesla's high-tech electric vehicles all depend on components from overseas. If those parts suddenly cost more, companies will have two choices: eat the extra costs or pass them on to customers. Tesla, in particular, is in a tight spot. The company's reputation is built on cutting-edge innovation, but many of its critical parts, especially battery components and semiconductors, come from Europe. If those imports become too expensive, Tesla could be forced to slow production or raise prices, neither of which is good news for investors or consumers. And just when American automakers thought things couldn't get worse, the EU has thrown another punch: a 25% tariff on US-made cars sold in Europe. This is a serious blow for brands like Jeep, Cadillac, and Ford, which have spent years trying to gain a foothold in the European market. With these new tariffs in place, a Jeep Wrangler or Ford Mustang could become too expensive for European buyers. Why pay more for an American SUV when they can get a more affordable German or Japanese model? European car dealerships are already bracing for impact, predicting a steep drop in demand for American-made vehicles. And the numbers paint a grim picture. Last year alone, the US exported over $60 billion worth of vehicles to Europe. Now, with these new tariffs, that revenue stream is at serious risk. If sales plummet, American factories could slow down production, leading to layoffs and economic strain in key manufacturing states. The hardest hit segment? Large SUVs and pickup trucks, already a tough sell in Europe due to strict emissions rules and high fuel prices. With the added tariff, these vehicles might become nearly impossible to move off the lot. American farmers are bracing for impact as Europe strikes back in a trade battle that's quickly spiraling out of control. This time, it's not just cars on the chopping block. US agriculture is taking a direct hit. The European Union has slapped new tariffs on a range of American farm goods, including soybeans, beef, and poultry. And for farmers across the Midwest, this couldn't come at a worse time. Many are still struggling to recover from the last trade war, when tariffs on China triggered a wave of retaliatory measures against US crops. Now they're facing yet another economic squeeze. Only this time, the pain is coming from across the Atlantic. The Midwest, often called America's breadbasket, is feeling the heat. States like Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas depend heavily on farm exports to Europe. If demand drops, prices could crash, leaving farmers in a financial freefall. And for those who supported Trump in past elections, this new round of tariffs might test their loyalty in ways they never expected. Meanwhile, some of the biggest names in agribusiness, Cargill, Tyson Foods, and Archer Daniels Midland, are scrambling to find new buyers. But shifting exports to different countries isn't as simple as flipping a switch. Trade deals take years to negotiate, and the sudden loss of European demand could leave a massive gap that's tough to fill. And it doesn't stop with farmers. The fallout is spreading fast. Companies that make farming equipment, think John Deere and Caterpillar, are watching the situation closely. If farmers start pulling back on spending, these manufacturers could see their sales tumble. That could mean factory slowdowns, layoffs, and a ripple effect across entire communities that depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. Across the Atlantic, European businesses aren't immune to the damage either. Luxury car makers like BMW and Mercedes-Benz have spent decades building cars in the US for export back to Europe. BMW's massive plant in South Carolina and Mercedes' factory in Alabama are key parts of their global strategy. But if the new tariffs drive up costs, they may have to rethink their American investments, potentially cutting jobs and shifting production elsewhere. Then there's the steel industry. Europe ships millions of tons of steel to the US every year, but Trump's latest 25% tariff is already choking off that trade. European steel producers are warning that they could lose up to 3.7 million tons in exports, a devastating blow to an industry that's already struggling with rising costs and stiff competition from China. Despite growing concerns from business leaders, economists, and even some of his own political allies, Trump's administration isn't backing down. The White House insists these tariffs are necessary to defend American industries from unfair competition. Officials point out that while the US had a mere 2.5% tariff on European cars, the EU was already charging a 10% duty on American-made vehicles. From Trump's perspective, Raising tariffs is simply a way of evening the score. But critics aren't buying it. They argue that instead of fixing the problem, these policies are pushing the US and Europe into an economic showdown that could leave both sides worse off. The American Chamber of Commerce has already sounded the alarm, warning that if this escalates any further, it could drain billions from the US economy and put countless jobs at risk. Meanwhile, European leaders are calling for cooler heads to prevail. EU Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič has already flown to Washington in an attempt to find common ground, but talks have gone nowhere. His message was clear. Europe is open to negotiation, but it won't make one-sided concessions. As he put it, you need both hands to clap. When one domino falls in a trade war, the rest don't stay standing for long. What started as a dispute over car tariffs has quickly snowballed into a full-blown economic battle, pulling in industries from agriculture to energy, and even raising concerns about national security. The fallout is spreading fast, and leaders on both sides of the Atlantic are scrambling to contain the damage. In Washington, Trump is doubling down. His tough stance on tariffs fits perfectly into his America First message, a key pillar of his 2024 campaign. His administration is pushing the idea that these trade moves are necessary to protect American jobs and industries. But here's the catch. Many of the states feeling the worst effects of this trade war are the same states Trump is relying on to secure re-election. The auto industry alone employs over 1 million people in the US, and rising production costs are already causing panic among manufacturers. If job losses start hitting factories in swing states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, the political landscape could shift dramatically. And then there's agriculture. Midwestern farmers who have long been loyal to Trump are now staring down the barrel of a financial crisis. If European markets dry up due to new tariffs, their crops could become significantly harder to sell. For farmers in places like Iowa, Nebraska, and Wisconsin, that could mean plummeting incomes, farm closures, and economic turmoil. It's a dangerous gamble. Trump is betting that his base will stick with him no matter what, but when paychecks and livelihoods are on the line, even the most dedicated supporters might start questioning whether these trade policies are worth the cost. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European leaders are navigating their own political minefield. They can't afford to appear weak in the face of US pressure, but at the same time, a prolonged trade war isn't in their best interest either. Big-name European automakers like BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes-Benz have deep investments in the US, running massive factories that produce cars for export back to Europe. But with tariffs threatening their bottom line, these companies may be forced to make tough decisions. Decisions that could mean cutting back on US operations and shifting production elsewhere. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has made it clear Europe is willing to negotiate, but they won't be strong-armed into a deal that puts them at a disadvantage. She's repeatedly warned that tariffs don't just impact businesses, they raise consumer prices, disrupt global supply chains, and ultimately make both economies weaker. But this battle isn't just about money anymore. The tension between the US and the EU is straining one of the world's strongest alliances, and the consequences could go far beyond trade. Military cooperation, climate agreements, and diplomatic relations with countries like Russia and China are all on the line. For years, the US and Europe have worked closely on everything from security to economic policy. But with trust between them eroding, long-standing partnerships could start to unravel. And that opens the door for new players to step in. China, for one, is watching this trade war unfold with great interest. Beijing has been aggressively expanding its trade network, especially in Europe, and this US-EU dispute might be the perfect opportunity for China to strengthen its economic ties with European markets. If European companies start looking for alternative suppliers, China is more than ready to fill that role. A deeper trade partnership between China and Europe could shift the global economic balance, weakening America's influence in ways that go beyond tariffs and trade disputes. And China isn't the only one eyeing an opportunity. As American car sales take a hit in Europe, other countries are stepping up to fill the gap. Japan and South Korea, already major players in the global auto industry, are perfectly positioned to take advantage of this shift. Companies like Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, and Kia could see a surge in demand as European buyers turn away from US-made vehicles that have become too expensive due to tariffs. But this isn't just about short-term losses, it's about losing ground in a market that took decades to build. Once consumers get comfortable with new brands, it's incredibly difficult for American automakers to claw back their position. Meanwhile, the energy industry is facing its own shakeup. For years, the US has been a top supplier of liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Europe, especially after the region began distancing itself from Russian energy. American companies had carved out a reliable market, shipping billions of dollars worth of LNG overseas. But with tensions rising, European energy firms are rethinking their reliance on the US. Alternative suppliers, like Qatar and Australia, are already being considered as long-term partners. If those deals go through, American energy companies could lose a massive chunk of business. Not just for a few months, but possibly for decades. And it doesn't stop there. Some European officials are floating the idea of stricter environmental regulations on imported fossil fuels, which could make it even harder for US energy companies to sell their products in the region. If the EU pushes harder on renewable energy investment, it could permanently shift the global energy balance, leaving American oil and gas producers struggling to compete. But the tech industry might be the most fragile of all. For years, the US and Europe have worked together on advancements in cybersecurity, AI, and semiconductor production. But now, that relationship is under strain. One of the biggest concerns? Microchips. The semiconductor industry relies on a finely balanced global supply chain. America leads in chip design, Europe provides critical manufacturing equipment, and Asia handles mass production. If tariffs start getting in the way, it could disrupt the entire industry, leading to shortages, rising prices, and supply chain chaos. And that's not all. Tech giants like Apple, Intel, Nvidia, and Qualcomm are now bracing for tougher regulations in Europe. EU leaders are considering new antitrust rules and stricter data privacy laws in response to the US's aggressive trade stance. If this turns into a full-blown tech dispute, it could push Europe to reduce its dependence on American technology altogether, an outcome that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. Back on Wall Street, the financial markets are already feeling the pressure. Stock prices for major automakers, energy firms, and agricultural companies have been on a roller coaster as investors try to predict how this trade war will play out. The auto sector in particular has long been an early warning sign for the broader economy, and right now, the signals aren't looking good. Some analysts are already predicting a slowdown in manufacturing and consumer spending, warning that if this conflict drags on, both the US and Europe could be headed for a deeper economic downturn. But the most alarming part of this trade war isn't just the economic fallout, it's what it's doing to global alliances. What started as a dispute over car tariffs has now turned into a full-scale economic battle, spilling into industries that had nothing to do with the original argument. The strain between Washington and Brussels is growing, and as both sides dig in, the consequences are only becoming more severe. And with the clock ticking toward key deadlines, businesses and workers on both sides of the Atlantic are left wondering how much worse things might get. For everyday Americans, the effects of this trade war are about to hit where it hurts most: their wallets. Prices on cars, groceries, and electronics are all set to climb, as new tariffs make European imports more expensive. Auto dealerships across the country are already warning customers, if the 25% tariff on European vehicles sticks, expect sticker shock. Brands like BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Audi, longtime favorites among American buyers, could soon be priced out of reach for many consumers. But this isn't just a luxury car problem. Even vehicles built in the US are caught in the crossfire, as many rely on European-made parts. That means higher costs for manufacturers, which ultimately means more expensive cars for American drivers. And across the Atlantic, European automakers are facing their own crisis. The EU has hit back with its own 25% tariff on American cars, putting companies like Ford and Tesla in a tough spot. Both brands have worked hard to grow their presence in the European market, but now, customers already struggling with inflation may opt for homegrown alternatives rather than pay more for American-made vehicles. If that happens, US automakers could lose a major slice of their European market share, one they may never get back. But the trouble doesn't stop with cars. American farmers are taking a direct hit too. The EU's countermeasures are zeroing in on products from states that played a key role in Trump's election victories, like soybeans from Louisiana, beef from Nebraska, and produce from Georgia and Alabama. These tariffs aren't just about trade, they're strategic. By targeting agricultural goods from Republican strongholds, the EU is applying political pressure right where it matters most. For farmers, many of whom are still struggling from previous trade disputes, this could be devastating. If European demand for US crops drops, prices could collapse, forcing some farms to shut down entirely. With both the agriculture and auto industries feeling the squeeze, labor unions and trade groups are beginning to push back. Industry leaders are warning that prolonged tariffs could lead to widespread job losses, factory closures, and a freeze on new investments. In response, some US car manufacturers are considering a drastic move, shifting production to Mexico or Canada to avoid the tariffs altogether. But that's a risky bet. If Trump expands tariffs to include those countries as well, these companies could still find themselves trapped in the middle of this economic storm. And it's not just American businesses facing uncertainty. European manufacturers are also feeling the pressure, particularly the steel industry. The EU exports millions of tons of steel to the US every year, but with Trump's new 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, that pipeline is rapidly drying up. European steelmakers are already bracing for major losses, and some are warning that if this continues, production slowdowns and layoffs may be inevitable. The European steel industry is bracing for a major hit, with new tariffs slashing exports by an estimated 3.7 million tons. Manufacturers are scrambling to figure out their next move. It couldn't come at a worse time. Steelmakers are already struggling with rising energy costs and fierce competition from China. Now, with one of their biggest markets shrinking, the pressure is on. And speaking of China, Beijing is watching this trade war unfold with a quiet sense of opportunity. While the US and Europe are locking horns, China has been strengthening its own trade relationships with European businesses. If tensions between Washington and Brussels continue, China could step in to fill the gap, offering European companies an alternative without the risk of tariffs. If that happens, the global trade map could change for good, shifting power away from the US and giving China a stronger foothold in European markets. Meanwhile, the energy sector isn't escaping the fallout either. For years, the US has been one of Europe's main suppliers of liquefied natural gas, LNG. But with trade tensions rising, European leaders are rethinking that relationship. They're already exploring alternative suppliers like Qatar and Australia, countries that could offer stable long-term agreements without the risk of sudden tariff hikes. And it doesn't stop there. Some European policymakers are pushing for increased investment in renewable energy as a way to cut dependence on American fossil fuels altogether. If they move forward with that plan, US energy companies could see their European market shrink permanently. But energy isn't the only industry at risk. The tech world is feeling the strain too. For years, the US and Europe have worked together on innovation, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. But that collaboration is now on shaky ground. Some European leaders are already discussing tougher regulations on American tech giants, which could make it harder for companies like Apple, Google, and Intel to do business in one of their biggest markets. That could mean anything from new privacy laws to tighter restrictions on US technology, making it more expensive and complicated for American firms to operate in Europe. And as industries struggle, financial markets are reacting. Stock prices for major automakers, energy producers, and agricultural firms have been on a roller coaster as investors try to predict the long-term damage. The longer these tariffs stay in place, the greater the risk of an economic slowdown. Some analysts are even warning that if this trade war drags on, both the US and Europe could be heading toward a recession. Behind the scenes, diplomatic efforts are still underway. EU Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič has made it clear that Europe is open to negotiation, but only if the US is willing to strike a fair deal. Meanwhile, Trump's administration is holding its ground, arguing that these tariffs are necessary to protect American jobs and industries. But trade wars rarely play out the way politicians expect.